Okay, EverrettsVLOG, I decided I would play your video and respond.
I'm going to argue in this video that no such things as selves exist, and if you want to define them as existing, they certainly don't think and feel or do any things that we all think we do, okay?
Okay, right away, I think this has to do with our ability to name things. I mean, we're going to collect examples of what we think are examples of the self existing or behaving a part of a system. And we're going to say what? The self doesn't exist, but those behaviors will remain existing. So by calling those behaviors examples of self, something's going to exist. It might not be what we think of as self. But anyway, this comes up more.
That's the argument that I'm making in this video. I'm going to define existence in a bit. Sort of. So I'd like to start the argument by pointing out that your brain normally perceives the world and then represents the world. Now, in the case of a self, obviously it doesn't perceive and then represent a self. It just constructs the self.
Okay, that's not obvious because I don't think that's true at all. I don't see why you'd say it constructs the self. The self is already existing. It's one of these prior conditions of which we receive all of them from nature, or in more detail we could say from the evolutionary biological process. And the mind has a bunch of examples of something it thinks are common. There's a pattern. And those are examples involve intentionality and will in the case of examples of self. Okay, so we form a conception of self by looking at those behaviors. Okay, we're not constructing the self. The self constructs the ideas, including the idea about the self, a self-referential idea, in other words, self-consciousness.
So right off the bat, the question is, well, if the brain is constructing a self, in what sense does the self exist? Now, commonly, people will say, well, the self exists, it's just not, one physical part of the brain, it's distributed all over the brain and so on.
And the thing is, the self exists as a conception. We apply this conception of self as we apply identity. I use the example of what if a meteorologist just takes a 1 cubic meter of space and watches it, and decides to talk about that as an individual unit of space. Obviously, there's no intrinsic identity to that space as opposed to the same cubic meter shifted a little bit. But that could still be useful. Why? Because the meteorologist is studying how the atmosphere works as an open system, and he can watch that, or she can watch that. Okay, we apply the sense of self in the same way. It's like we try to identify something as a self. It's something we're going to identify with, and we use the word self in all different ways. Sometimes we mean this conscious mind part. Sometimes we're talking about the whole brain, including unconscious parts. Often we're talking about the entire body. We can be talking about our community, or some sort of special community, like our fellow football fans or something. And we can have a sense of self and identity in any of those spheres that we like to. The self, therefore, is an idea. If you're going to seek, well, what is the essential self? Well, there's not going to be an essential self. You can have a system that can be described as a system involving a sense of self, because it's like some other system that involves that. Ultimately, like my system, the system of my perceptions, which I am willing to say that I am related enough to other agents, other human agents, and even animals that, I have reason to go ahead and say, well, they're probably having that same sense of self, and I'm generalizing from the system in my case, which has a sense of self. And I am doing so based on behaviors of self. When I assign you a sense of self, it's because you show the behaviors of a sentient being. Okay, so we are assigning this meaning to various subsystems. And if you're looking for, but which subsystem should it really be assigned to? Well, there is no particular one it should really be assigned to. If you're talking about ethics in your community, then your sense of self is as one with the community. If you're talking about what should you eat for dinner, your sense of self is, your body and the nutrition of your body. If you're asking, questions about how the conscious will might control or be controlled by the mind, then you talk about the sense of self as limited by, your conscious apprehension at a given moment. And this is how the search for essences leads us astray, in my opinion. As opposed to searches for good descriptions of behavior, right? I do have a replacement. I'm not saying give up on searching for knowledge. No, I'm just saying don't cast the knowledge as a search for essence. Cast it as trying to get good descriptions for behavior.
And so it does exist physically, people will say. But if you think about it, if you imagine a unicorn, okay, that unicorn can't think and feel things.
Okay, stop. You're making an assumption. Again, I think you're relying on this idea that it's just an idea, so it's immaterial. It doesn't have neurons, but wait. The unicorn is an idea in your mind. It is being generated. Its image is being generated by a thinking process, namely one of your unconscious thinking process, or possibly even conscious if you're willfully visualizing this. Okay, so the unicorn exists in a brain. It has access to your brain. It is your brain. And you cannot assume that it doesn't think or feel. Does it have this subjective moment inside it? Well, we don't know. But then again, I don't know if you do, right? I'm assuming from your behavior. I'm not assuming, but I'm deducing from your behavior, these similarities to my own behavior, and I'm deducing that, okay, seems like sentience. I grant that level of self. I say that you're thinking because of that behavior. And similarly, to apply the problem in the domain that you're applying it to. What about in a dream? You look at your own body. You look in a mirror and see your body. That's a construct of your brain. Are you going to say that therefore you don't think and feel? No, you're mixing up the use and reference here. You're mixing up a conception of something and the thing itself. Okay, so strictly speaking, you could say that you in a dream don't think either. No, it's something behind that image. The image isn't thinking, and we say in shorthand that that's you behaving. So the image of the unicorn isn't thinking, but it's still the result of a thinking process. And its behavior is a result of a thinking process. And when that happens, we call that thinking. It's like we don't have to answer the question of is the wheel free or not to understand if what you're doing is thinking. Maybe you aren't doing the thinking. You're just the result of inevitable physics. Well, you're still thinking, right? You just don't have control of it. But that's an assumption maybe we shouldn't have assigned to thinking. Of course, I believe that there is a will, so.
Okay. It's just it's a construct of the brain. Similarly, if the self is a construct of the brain, then it can't think and feel.
See, I guess what I'm getting at is that you're drawing the conclusion in the opposite direction that I would advise. It would make more sense to presume that the unicorn, being a construct of the mind, thinks and feels, since the self, which is a construct of the mind, thinks and feels. And since the unconscious thought processes seem to generate feelings and seem to generate thoughts that go on while we are not consciously thinking of them, and therefore we could assume or presume that it is a reasonable hypothesis, unproved but still reasonable and worth investigating, that our conceptions think and feel, and parts of our brain have some sense of local identity to which these feelings and whatnot can be attached while they're being generated.
Okay. But put your experiences aside, okay? For now. Just think about the logic here. I mean, if the brain constructs a self in its self model, okay? Call it a conscious self model, like Metzinger kind of does. He calls it a phenomenal self.
Okay, but that's a model. That's not the self itself, right? Or you're accepting my other line of argument that we get to define the self, and the self is whatever is modeled. In which case, there's no question: is it really there? Yeah, it's there. It refers to the model. We're talking about the model, and then we're asking only, well, is there material behavior there that we have attributed to the self, and that behavior is there as well? All we don't know is how the self really works. What the character of that is. It's not a question of do these things exist.
Model. So if the phenomenal self model creates a model of the brain, it models it as if it's a self, okay? That self, that fantasy, even if it's conscious, it can't think and feel because it's a construct. It's basically your brain's imagination.
But that's the point. We have evidence that mental constructs can think and feel because we're a mental construct and we think and feel.
Okay? So we're already just that. What did that take, a minute and a half or something? And we're probably already with the